Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining this online conference, and I am pleased to see numerous people participating, despite June being the summer exam session of Foscari. My name is Angelica. I am a third-year university student here of Japanese language here at Foscari University of Venice, and member of the Gesshin Student Association. Firstly, I wish to say thank you to our speaker for taking part in this event, Dr. Monden, and also to my colleague, Erika Yacorno Quarantino, for helping me organize this event. Dr. Masafumi Monden writes and teaches Japanese language, modern Japanese cultural history, fashion, art and popular culture, gender studies and international relations, focusing on Australia's ties with Asia. Before joining the University of Sydney, Dr. Monden most recently taught at the University of Western Australia. His research interests includes media and popular culture in Japan, fashion and dress studies, youth culture, body, gender and selfhood, construction and cultural conception of girlhood and boyhood, intercultural interaction and communications, cultural history of modern Japan, and historical relationships between modern Australia, Japan, and Asia. Dr. Monden is currently working on 2 books-length projects, Maiden Sans Frontières, a study of Shōjo cultures in Japan and beyond, with Dr. Lucy Frasen and Dr. Emerald King, hope I'm pronouncing that right, and Salaryman to Shonen, male models and consumer culture in post-war Japan. He won many awards and honors, and his latest publications include Midnight Cinderella, A Moral Shōjo and the Japanese Girl Culture, Magical Bird Maidens, Reconsidering Romantic Fairy Tales in Japanese Popular Culture, Shōjo Across Media, Exploring Girl Practices in Contemporary Japan, and many others. Today's conference is centered about the figure of the Shōjo, an iconic representation of femininity in Japan, in which Dr. Masafumi is an expert. The term Shōjo, especially here in Italy, is very often connected to the animation word, but Shōjo actually holds a much bigger meaning, as it connotes fashion styles such as Lolita, music genres, movie, and all sorts of arts. Dr. Masafumi Monden on today's conference will explore the multifaceted, visually striking Shōjo culture and style, examining the fashion and the visual aspects of it. Well, my presentation is now over. Thank you for listening, and let me welcome Dr. Monden.
Thank you, Angelica-san. So I'll just share my slide now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So hope it's working. Yes. So good morning, everyone in Italy, and hello, my name is Masafumi Monden, and before starting, I'd like to thank Angelica-san and Erika-san and Gesshin Student Association for giving me this opportunity to give my talk today. I'm very excited to give this talk, so hopefully you are going to enjoy it as well. Okay, so this is an image by Japanese illustrator, magazine editor, and fashion designer Junichi Nakahara. It was originally produced for a girls' magazine called Shōjo no Tomo, or Girl's Friend, in 1940. I wanted to start with this image today. Okay, so I wanted to start with this image today because I think it perfectly captures the idea of Shōjo, which is the topic of today's talk. So what is Shōjo? Probably you know what Shōjo is, or you probably have heard what Shōjo is about, but the word Shōjo is often translated into English simply as girl, but the Japanese meaning is more complex. Visually, the concept of Shōjo is frequently ultra-feminine, adorned with flowers, ribbons, frills, flowing and fluttering movements, and leaf cactus with bright, sparkly eyes. Nakahara is one of the pioneers who introduced this graphic interpretation of Shōjo, which continues today, as you can see in these images. And in this talk, I want to focus on the 2 main ways the Japanese concept of Shōjo is expressed, which are Shōjo manga, or Japanese girls comics, and fashion. And where possible, I also try to refer to the aesthetics concept of kawaii, but kawaii is such a big concept that I may not have a time. So I probably have to save it for the next time if I get an opportunity. But anyway, one of the aims for my research has been to examine the multiple ways that shoujo is used as a cultural imagination. And in this talk, I would first like to look briefly at how the concept of shoujo came into existence with the modernization of the state. Then we will move on to look at girls' comics or shoujo manga and how a group of manga works have combined shoujo aesthetics with dress. And finally, we'll look at how shoujo influences fashion in Japan, signaling both its enduring popularity and its performative nature. So the first question is, what is shoujo, and how did the concept of shoujo come into existence? And the answer is written in one of the books that you can find, which the book is titled Shoujo as Construction by Shuko Watanabe, that tells us the idea of shoujo was first and used as an early form of social engineering in the late 19th century. In the wake of the Sakoku period, when Japan was largely close to foreign influence, Japan aimed to strengthen itself to compete with the European nations and America. Higher education institutions for young women were established to further this aim, but it required young women to put off marriage and having children in order to attend. So the concept of shoujo originally served this ideological purpose, constructed by the Japanese government in order to encourage girls to embody ryosai kenbo, which means good wife, wise mother. And probably some of you have heard this ryosai kenbo, and you probably think it's a purely Japanese ideology. But actually, this was an ideology inspired by Victorian notions of true womanhood, that is 19th century European ideas, together with Confucius values. So it's sort of like a mixture of European and Chinese ideal femininity, which is sort of like modified to fit the Japanese context. According to the Japanese government, the shoujo demonstrated three virtues, which are affection, chastity or purity, and beauty. And this indoctrination was aimed at female students between the ages of 12 and 17. In those days, the most effective way to spread this concept of shoujo was to visualize and articulate it through popular culture, such as girls' magazines, fictions, and illustrations. And despite the crafted and imposed origins of shoujo, it found a willing audience, and by the early 1900s, cultural representations of the girl were increasingly produced by shoujo writers and artists for girl readers. Poetic romanticized images of the girl, or shoujo, were distributed through flowery sentimental fiction targeted at school-age girls. One of the most famous was female author Nobuko Yoshiya's Flower Tales, which is a series of stories about romantic relationships between young women. This kind of shoujo culture is today perceived as a girl's sort of delicate or soft rebellion against the patriarchal, business-oriented world of masculinity, especially in pre-war Japan. As Hiromitsu Chedorase points out in her analysis of Yoshiya's Flower Tales, by consciously indulging themselves in a world of floral beauty and romanticism, girl readers of such novels or fictions rejected, even if momentarily, the intrusion of male codes and institutions in their lives. Even it was originally devised and imposed by adult men like the Japanese government, the genre of shoujo fiction was adopted and appropriated by the girls as their own, exhibiting a degree of autonomy that has, as an expert on contemporary shoujo culture and linguistic anthropologist, Laura Miller has rightly urged, becomes a feature of shoujo culture in Japan. Yoshio's flower tales have been reissued a number of times with new illustrations, and one of the artists to illustrate later editions was Junichi Nakahara, as you can see in this image. And he's particularly well known for his contribution to Japanese girls' culture and the image of shoujo. He was inspired by a genre of painting called lyrical illustration, or jojoga, which was popular between the 1910s and the 1930s. Jojoga is characterized by the delicate sensibility of the artist, conveyed through the combination of artistic imagination and realism, as you can see in this image done by Yumeji Takehisa, one of the most famous jojoga artists. And its aesthetic style has contributed to the style of post-war shoujo manga, which will return. But first, I would like to talk a little bit more about Nakahara. Nakahara made his debut as illustrator for the magazine Shōjo no Tomo, or Girl's Friend, in 1932, when he was 19. From 1935, he produced cover art for the magazine, which was particularly well loved by its girl readers. He also edited a fashion feature section called Girls Students Fashion Pages from 1937. But in 1940, against the backdrop of war, the Japanese government intervened with the magazine to change the style of his illustrations. The Japanese government, influenced by the military, felt his shoujo images like these were unhealthy. So for them, these young women looked too beautiful, too fragile, and too skinny, when the government was promoting more robust and stronger images of girls who died to protect and fight for the country. As you probably would expect, Nakahara refused to give in to this and resigned. So the covers of Shōjo no Tomo changed or shifted from like this. Actually, this is the last cover that Nakahara did for Shōjo no Tomo, to something like this, which is one of the covers for Shōjo no Tomo in 1944, so during the war period. So you can see that what the government wanted, sort of like images of shoujo, which was completely quite dramatically different from Nakahara's idea of shoujo. It was reported that Nakahara's departure broke the hearts of many girl readers. So many girl readers actually didn't like the government-imposed image of shoujo, and they sent letters of protest to the publisher. And the magazine allegedly lost more than 7,000 readers with Nakahara's departure. But after the war, Nakahara came back, and he launched his own women's fashion magazines called Soleil in 1946, first as quarterly, then bi-monthly. It was followed by Himawari, which means sunflower in Japanese, a fashion magazine for teenagers, in 1947. Himawari was renamed as Junior Soleil in 1953 and continued until 1959, when Nakahara became ill due to exhaustion and overwork, and in 1960, both Soleil and Junior Soleil ceased to exist. While he designed many styles, including European-style dresses and Japanese kimono, as well as menswear, Nakahara's fashion designs are best remembered as romantic styles for girls, embellished with ribbons, frills, and flower-like skirts, so like very much like an embodiment of shoujo aesthetics that we've been talking about, like these. And as you can see from these images, Nakahara's ideal girls, or shoujo, are exquisitely dressed, upper-class young ladies with delicately styled hair, large eyes, thin waist, and long limbs, which were and still are an embodiment of shoujo in Japanese culture. Nakahara influenced both main forms of visual expression of this girl or shoujo tradition, so shoujo illustration and shoujo fashion. His magazine Junior Soleil also featured illustrations of Rune Naito and Chiaki Fuji, among others, and they sort of created or set like a path for a specific aesthetic that we now call like Kawaii today. And their fashion illustration like art, along with Nakahara's that you can see in these like slides, in turn influenced the graphic language of shoujo manga or girls comics. After the war, the popularity of shoujo fiction and magazines was gradually taken over by shoujo manga. Although not quite as popular today at their peak in the 1990s, shoujo manga is still a strong influence on the image and aesthetic of shoujo. Although the beginning of shoujo manga has traditionally been regarded as Osamu Tezuka's Princess Knight or Ribbon no Kishi in 1953, more recent studies have explored the presence of shoujo manga prior to Tezuka's, including the link between shoujo manga and fictions, the style of Makoto Takahashi, who's featured here, and the influence of lyrical illustration artists such as Nakahara, Kasho Takabatake, and Yumeji Takehisa on the works of early shoujo manga. The rise of pioneering women manga artists such as Masako Watanabe, who debuted in 1952, Hideko Mizuno in 1955, and Miyako Maki in 1957 were followed by a group of artists in the 1970s who are often seen as having revolutionized shoujo manga and elevated the values of shoujo manga as a subgenre by sort of encompassing or embracing subgenres like science fiction, fantasy, mystery, social drama, and sort of like a subversion of gender, like many of their manga featured cross-dressed heroes and heroines, for example. So now it is worth us taking a moment to take a look at the definition of shoujo manga. So how do we define shoujo manga? And this is particularly important because this definition of shoujo manga has become increasingly broad recently. And this is partly due to the increased popularity of online publishing. Before the internet, manga works were usually serialized in manga magazines first, with popular works later published in paperback format, which is called tankobon. Manga magazines were often segmented according to gender and age groups of target readership. And Ishida Saiko, who is one scholar who has tried to develop a framework, says that, she has actually articulated two fundamental definitions of shoujo manga, which can be very useful for us. And these two definitions are, first, substantially, manga that are first published in magazines targeted primarily at girls or shoujo, like Boys Over Flowers or Hanayori Dango, which was first serialized in a Japanese shoujo manga magazine called Margaret. And secondly, and conceptually, those manga works categorized as shoujo manga because of their authors' narrative themes or graphic styles. So some manga artists who publish in magazines that are not considered to be shoujo manga, so maybe like a manga magazine for men, older men, for example. But if these manga artists have a reputation for being shoujo manga artists, then their work might be considered as shoujo manga when they are published as paperback editions. And also, graphically, shoujo manga is often characterized by big starry eyes, flower petals scattered across the frame, and blurred or irregular panels, and highly detailed and embellished graphics, as you can see in this excerpt from Naoko Takeuchi's very famous Sailor Moon. The beauty of the principal character is another essential importance in shoujo manga. So flowing locks, slender limbs, an elongated neck, and long, delicate fingers are the distinguishing characteristics in typical girls' comics or shoujo manga, as you can see in this example of Baki Yamato's Here Comes Miss High Color or Haikara-san ga Toru. And Yamato has been known for creating all these beautiful characters in her work. These physical characteristics that I've sort of explained have often raised questions of ethnicity in manga studies. So for example, the heroine in Haikara-san ga Toru, who is featured here, as you can see, she is dressed in kimono. But so we sort of know that she's a Japanese character, but the question is, does she look Japanese? And so are other characters in the manga. So are these features in shoujo manga meant to represent Westerners? Some people read these traits of large eyes and long limbs, as you can see in this image, as conforming to Euro-American beauty ideals. But others argue that this is nonsense because these characters don't even look like real humans in the first place. I am not going to venture into that debate here, and I will leave it to you to judge. But I do want to point out one thing, which is artists like Nakahara and Rune Naito, who influenced the shoujo manga, were also fashion illustrators. And also Makoto Takahashi, who is a very influential figure, like an artist on shoujo illustrations in shoujo manga, also revealed that he was initially strongly influenced by Euro-American fashion magazines like Vogue in the 1950s. As you can see in this famous 1940s fashion illustration by Italian Rene Gros, the bodies in fashion illustrations of the time are quite exaggerated, just like shoujo manga. If you compare these images, you probably get the point. So fashion illustrations might have been as much an influence as ethnicity when we are talking about the characters and how the characters are depicted in shoujo manga. So we've been talking about manga, and the manga offers an interesting medium to examine the concept of shoujo. Shoujo manga has frequently been seen as a medium that is created for young women by women, where women exercise creative control and expression, particularly from the 1970s. The image of shoujo, first created and promoted by men, is now controlled largely by women creators. But the importance of shoujo manga doesn't stop there. In shoujo manga culture, producers such as artists and editors formulate their ideas from wider discourses of girls' culture, and at the same time create a culture that reflects and shapes what girls want. Therefore, shoujo manga does not simply reflect the desires of girls, as Jennifer Pro says. It mediates them as well, and that's why looking at shoujo manga can be important when we think about the idea of shoujo. A subgenre in shoujo manga in the mid to late 1970s, known as otome-chiku or maiden-esque manga, was especially seen as important in recording shoujo culture at the time. This began with works by manga artists in Ribbon magazine, which is a monthly shoujo manga magazine targeted at the youngest group of audiences, such as Yumiko Tabuchi and Eiko Muzu, whose works are featured in this slide, as well as Hideko Tachikake, among others. Often set in an ordinary everyday world, automatic manga are known by critics to feature shy, ordinary girl protagonist whose intrinsic value is affirmed by her often socially popular love interest. So it sort of has a Cinderella-like narrative set in a contemporary, ordinary high school. But what is really significant about automatic or maidenesque shoujo manga is its strong focus on fashion, like preppy or folklore styles, as you can see in this slide, and cute stationery goods, further referring to fancy goods from the fancy goods boom in the 1970s and the 1980s, like Sanrio products. So it has a very strong link to contemporary kawaii culture as well. So in automatic manga, clothes are playing an important role, and actually clothes and fashion can be very important in shoujo manga. While some academics try to distinguish dress from clothes, styles from fashion, and fashion from dress, in practice, these terms are used interchangeably, although they could be a little bit different, and I use them interchangeably as well in this talk. Dress is considered to carry symbolic meanings. It is a means of communication, but we need to be cautious because the meanings communicated through clothing can be very subtle and complex. As fashion historian Valerie Steele rightly says, its meanings depend on the context. Who wears it, when, along with what other clothes, what was the history of the garment. In other words, the meanings it carries can be very subtle and complex. And also, fictional text often use dress as a deliberate device to convey meanings. Claire Hughes argues that traditionally, aspects of dress have been used to portray aspects of personality, particularly when a character first enters the story. And in Japanese manga, including shoujo manga, use dress frequently in this way. And as I said, particularly in shoujo manga, it is very obvious. So for example, technically, it is because characters in manga are drawn in 2 dimensions, through line and tone, and are usually stylized. Manga artists usually have a style upon which all their graphic depictions of characters are based. So this means characters drawn by the same manga artist generally look alike. So hairstyles and especially clothes are considered to be a fundamental aspect of character imagery, which is like a signifiers in semiotics terms, to graphically indicate character personality, which we can take as like a signified in different panels. So for example, there's like a panel from a Japanese manga, and there are 2 characters. And how we distinguish one character from another, because they look very much alike, is by looking at the color of their hair. So it is crucial for the manga reader to be able to understand something of the character immediately, and often dress and hairstyles serve this purpose. But also in shoujo manga, dress or clothes can be intertwined with a narrative rather than it's just like a graphic importance. And I would like to look at that example. And I'd like to introduce you to Mariko Iwadate's manga work called White Satin Ribbon, or Shiroi Saten no Ribbon, which was first published in 1993. In this manga, dress plays a central role. A grandmother's white lace dress with a big satin ribbon, symbolic of familial affection the heroine Namiko desires. So the story focuses on a girl called Namiko, who lives with her mother after her parents' divorce. Namiko's older sister, who lives with their father, his new wife, and grandmother, often shows off the gifts she receives from their grandmother, who never gives anything to Namiko. But Namiko doesn't really care or shows any interest in any of the gifts that her sister shows off, except a white lace dress with a big satin ribbon that grandmother wore when she was 16. Namiko is neglected and dissatisfied, behaving like a perfect good girl to please her wealthy but mentally unstable mother. But on the other hand, bullying one of the girls in her class so badly that the girl attempts suicide. The grandmother's dress is a metaphor for the familial affection she so lacks, and the innocent, perfect, angelic shoujo identity that Namiko believes she can obtain by wearing the dress, even though she is a very awful, evil sort of person herself. And as we may expect, the story has a sinister turn. Namiko's attempt to steal the dress from grandmother and her older sister, who keeps telling Namiko that the dress will be hers and not Namiko will never get it, leads to the death of the grandmother. So she tries to steal the dress from her grandmother and the grandmother dies. Namiko is blackmailed by the brother of the girl she bullied, but blames her sister for the bullying and succeed in making him kidnap her sister as a result. So, with the two women who stand in her way gone, she can finally wear the dress. But Namiko is not an innocent shoujo anymore. At the age of 16, she is too mature, too vile to fit the dress and embody the perfect ideal, angelic shoujo ideal. So some scholars interpret texts like a white satin ribbon as indicating that this kind of shoujo culture, originally seen as a soft, delicate rebellion against a patriarchal system in the pre-war world, has now morphed into an idealized girlish identity that conforms to ideological gender schemes. The shoujo girl's attention is directed away from outward concerns and towards her inner self. In Miyasako Chizuru's opinion, the girl's autonomy is replaced by narcissism. Miyasako, who has written a famous series of essays on shoujo and non-shoujo, argues that a girl with a sense of independence cannot be a shoujo. In other words, Namiko is too independent, too autonomous to remain the ideal shoujo, even though physically she perfectly embodies it. So from this, we can say that Iwadate's manga targeted at a slightly an older age group objectify the shoujo figure and the concept of shoujo itself as a construction, a performance. So a white satin ribbon allows her readers to take pleasure in the pure aesthetics of shoujo and dress. And Iwadate's shiroi satin ribbon is based on the idea that dress is a quintessential medium to craft and communicate the identity of the one who wears it. I'd like to introduce another newer example, which is called Cocoon Entwined. And this manga series may not be considered as truly shoujo manga, but shares a lot of characteristics with typical shoujo manga, particularly its graphic elements and also a narrative focus on shoujo. It tells how clothes and human hair are a fundamental aspect of manga. And importantly, they also carry conceptual and symbolic meanings that are deeply intertwined with narrative themes, like a white satin ribbon or shiroi satin ribbon. Here's a bit of background information about the manga. In 2018, the artist Yuriko Hara started serializing Cocoon Entwined in the monthly manga magazine, Comic Beam. Launched in 1995 by a major publishing company, Kadokawa Shoten, this monthly manga magazine is known for featuring works that are individualistic in wide-range genres with much less editorial restriction than more commercial manga magazine. So artists like Yuriko Hara had a much greater sense of freedom and in expressing her or their creativity. So the story of Cocoon Entwined, or Mayu Matou in Japanese, is set in Japan in the contemporary period with a few added fantasy elements. Most of the scenes in Cocoon Entwined take place in an exclusive girls' academy, which we can think as a shoujo scape. The protagonist in the manga is a girl called Hoshimiya, the granddaughter of the school principal. The superficially peaceful academy is thrown into confusion when Hoshimiya's celebrated beautiful hair flies out of the window of her dormitory room. She has shed her precious hair before donating it for the school uniform. So in this academy, the school uniforms are made out of the girl students' long hair. And so Hoshimiya is wasting her long hair. And the story is threaded together from the perspectives of multiple narrators, most of them students of the academy, including two girls, Yoko and Hana. Yoko has a crush on tall and boyish Hana, who plays like a prince sort of role in the all-girls academy, whereas Hana is infatuated with enigmatic Hoshimiya. The most striking aspect of Cocoon Entwined or Mayu Matou is, as I just said, the human hair used to make the girls' school uniform. The senior girls cut their hair to make the uniforms in their last year of high school, just before their last term. And these girls remove their hair in a symbolic and aesthetic ritual, bidding farewell to their shoujo scape, and hence their shoujo selves, before departing into the outside world and become a member of society. Separately, both clothes and hair are intimate expressions. As Japanese and Asian studies scholar Vera Maki has rightly says, clothes are the boundary between body, self, and society, and they can be used to show acceptance and conformity, or to refusal of social expectations, including those of gender. Clothes, school uniforms included, a layer positioned between the body and society. And making those clothes from the hair of another person creates another level of intimacy and complexity. The hair uniform in Cocoon Entwined, in this sense, reflect the homosocial link between the shoujo or the girls. Alison Slater argues that treasured garments are associated with identity and deeply embedded in the wearer's relationship with other people. This relationship is illustrated in the manga when Hana, the boyish and a tall girl, enters the academy. Hana was too tall to wear any of the school uniforms available, but the suggestion of adding non-human hair thread to lengthen the uniform quietly upsets her. And this is perhaps because it reminds her of her alien status in the academy as a tall, rather idealized prince or boyish figure, and her non-girlishness or non-shoujo-ness makes Hana be marginalized in the girl or shoujo scape. But Hoshimiya comes in her rescue, and she cuts her lock of her famously beautiful hair and offers it to Hana to extend her uniform. And this act created a special attachment to Hoshimiya in Hana's mind, as if they shared a physical bond. In creating the school uniform made of girls' hair, the author of Mayumato was inspired by the artist Motohiko Otani's 1997 work titled Double Edge of Thought. And as you can see in this picture, this is a dress made of human hair, so a dress that is actually made of human hair. Such garments would not be functional, and their durability, one of the most important attributes for school uniform in real life, is questionable. So if a uniform is made of human hair, it would definitely not gonna last. Although hair shirts and other garments are known, these are generally made from coarse animal hair, and their function is specifically to be uncomfortable to wear. But of course, all dress in manga, including school uniforms, are non-material forms. They do not exist in a primarily physical sense, but in the imagination of the designer, artist, and the reader. Dressing manga actually does not need to exist at all, because as the scholar of manga and manga aesthetics, Jacqueline Band says, unlike photography or film, manga do not depend on an object which has to be shot, and so do not need to be measured by criteria of conventional realism. And this is a very important point when we think about manga. And indeed, manga critics argue that one of the important things about the concept of reality in manga is the making of apparently unrealistic depictions to be read as realistic, along with the assumption that readers will interpret it in that way. So accordingly, Hara's beautiful, sensitive graphics and spellbinding narratives make readers feel unconcerned of such unrealistic aspects. Clothes can trigger a body image and hence a memory of the body as well. While school uniform made of human hair is unrealistic, as we've seen, the idea of items of clothes or clothing being imbued with the attributes of their wearer is in fact widely prevalent in Japanese culture. The treatment of the uniform in Mayumato has echoes of the romantic ritual in Japanese schools, where on graduation day, a girl would ask for the second button of a gakuran uniform belonging to the boy she has a crush on. The gakuran is a traditional boys' school uniform modeled on a Peruvian military jacket. And in one hypothesis, the significance of the second button is that it is situated closest to the heart of the boy. Although this ritual is becoming less common these days, and partly because less boys are wearing gakuran uniform, like it's sort of replaced by a blazer style school uniform these days. But the satrial button in this ritual becomes a memory object and a simulacrum of the wearer. And the school uniform in Mayumato, as in the episode where Hoshimiya's locks are braided into Hana's school uniform, really retells this logic in a very Shōjo way. So while examples like a white satin ribbon and kokuen twined or mayumato indicate fashion or dress are closely tied and interwoven with the narrative, other shoujo manga focus graphic importance of dress. So there are heaps of shoujo manga works that sort of like focus on fashion and clothing elements, but in these works, fashion or dress or clothes are not necessarily playing a significant role, but more like a sort of like a visual graphic accessory sort of roles they play in these works. But but these indicate that in shoujo manga, fashion or dress or clothing is usually very important, either in a narrative way or in a graphic way. And so this perhaps is a good segue to the second major expression of shoujo tradition, which is fashion itself. Dress is considered to carry symbolic meanings. It is a means of communication, but we need to be cautious because, as I explained earlier in this talk, that the meanings communicated through clothing can be very subtle and complex. So they usually have some sort of like qualities or shared qualities that make us realize that the dress is sort of connoting that specific quality or element. And this means that there are certain shared qualities of the dress or look that evoke the qualities of shoujo-ness in Japanese culture when we think about the shoujo dress or shoujo style dress. And these qualities are most likely related to the idea of shoujo as put forward by renowned scholar of girls' culture, Masuko Honda, who sadly passed away early this year. But she's very influential. She's been very influential. And Honda was one of the first academics to study shoujo and fashion. And although her work dates from the 1980s, it is still relevant to the visual identity of shoujo today. Honda linked such fashion items as ribbons, flowers, frills, and fluttering skirts as the things that we've been talking about today, and Nakahara's illustrations of girls to the concept of shoujo. Honda sees the state of shoujo as a temporary state, kind of in between child and adult, where girls are old enough to appreciate romantic, beautiful, and often dreamy things, but not yet required to be too mature, too responsible. So they do not have to prioritize functionality over aesthetics. And since they are spared of much social responsibilities and it concerns temporality, they can appreciate anything romantic, dreamy, and largely impractical things on a purely aesthetic level. And a delicate and impractical sartorial items or fashion items, which Honda calls hirahira, due to the way they flutter in Japanese, are the visible manifestations of this state of shoujo. And for one thing, for Honda, this fashion aesthetic of flowing lace, frills, and ribbons signals the lightness, delicacy, and transient freedom ascribed to a state of girlish femininity. And her idea of shoujo gives a degree of independence to adolescent girls, separating them from children, but also from mature women. And one of the importance about this idea is the dress styles of Victorian period upper class girls have had a significant impact on Japanese shoujo fashion aesthetics, particularly the mid to late Victorian era fashion, as portrayed in Sir John Tenniel's famous illustrations of Alice in Lewis Carroll's books, is an obvious example of this. So like Alice look has been very, very popular in Japan, not only fashion world, but also as a costumes in music videos and so on. And the three virtues of shoujo in pre-war Japan, affection, chastity, and beauty, dovetail with the ideals of Victorian feminine beauty, which are like maternal, childlike, and modest, as well as healthy, natural, and virtuous. So there's a sort of like a link between Victorian femininity and Japanese shoujo aesthetics. And despite this girlish image, what is striking about the concept of shoujo is its presumed asexual quality. So shoujo as a cultural imagination are often considered as asexual, pure, comparatively autonomous beings. This does not, of course, necessarily mean that shoujo are immune from either eroticization or the objectifying, particularly male gaze. Indeed, the opposite is often the case, for the innocent and pure image of shoujo can be read as highly sexual to some individuals, and also shoujo can be sexually active as well, but on surface at least, they sort of maintain this pure, innocent, aesthetic sort of qualities. But it is also true that the asexuality associated with shoujo can, even if subtly, subvert preconceptions regarding sexuality and gender, as some scholars say. Performing shoujo can be one active and dynamic way that Japanese women can control their sexuality. And one such example can be found in Japanese Lolita fashion, or Lolita style, I should call, which is known for its hyperbolically girlish decorative style and appreciation of European dress forms of the early modern and romantic periods, as well as the 1950s American prom dress. Well, I try not to define when or how the style was born or who gave the style the name Lolita, which can be very complex. A similar dress aesthetic has long been present in Japan, as you can see in these images. The subculture of Olive magazine in the 1980s and 1990s is an obvious example. Olive, a now discontinued subculture magazine for romantic girl culture, marked the beginning of Kawaii as a mode of fashion in the 1980s. And one of the main styles subscribed to by Olive magazine was frill and lace adorned romantic girlish dresses associated with brands like Kaneko's Pink House or Atsuki Onishi or Milk and so on, which more or less share some aesthetic similarities with Lolita, as you can see in these images from Olive magazine. Like the image of shoujo, Lolita fashion is generally pre-sexual, despite the possibility of the style veering into the sexualized. One thing, the name Lolita is derived from Vladimir Nabokov's infamous novel Lolita. However, Lolita has been connoted even if slightly differently in Japan. And one of the interpretations that I really liked is from Michelle Liu Tariga, who sort of talks about Lolita fashion or Lolita style in relation to Alice in Wonderland. And she said that the style is more like a referring to Dolores or Lolita's perspective of her own self rather than that of middle-aged man hammered on Lolita. So the name in its original usage, at least, perhaps only referred to the aesthetic of shoujo, who is in between a child and mature woman. Significantly, Honda's idea of the shoujo fashion aesthetic that is well translated onto Lolita aesthetic is that while embellishment such as ribbons signals girlishness in modern times, it simultaneously draws attention away from the body of the one who wears it by concealing its shape and so perhaps avoids eroticization. The decorative fashion items of hira-hira, in James Walker's words, allow the simultaneous denial of womanhood and emphasis of femininity. So in other words, shoujo fashion with frills and ribbons can wrap and hide the shape of the body of the wearer, while they accentuate girlishness or shoujo-like qualities. The concept of shoujo, therefore, is not only an imposed, idealized construction, but also a means embraced and manipulated by girls themselves. Here we might notice some similarities between shoujo and the concept of kawaii, which is often translated as cute or lovely. The definition of kawaii, as I said earlier in this talk, too complex and too broad to be fully explored here. But a common type of kawaii in fashion is a style that is deliberately designed to make the wearer appear childlike and demure. Although shoujo and kawaii are not so synonymous, or doesn't necessarily be synonymous, it is important to recognize that shoujo femininity is frequently materialized by kawaii fashion aesthetics, like the case of Lolita style. Indeed, a fashion brand Milk, which is often seen as a predecessor of Lolita brands like Baby the Stars Shine Bright or Innocent World, is well known for offering romantic and girlish yet edgy styles, and it often uses the term kawaii when describing these designs themselves or itself. And as you can see, some of the clothes of Milk are very similar to Lolita styles, even before Lolita style became famous. And the link between shoujo manga and Lolita aesthetic is quite clearly indicated as well. Fumiko Isobe, co-founder of Baby, for example, acknowledged the strong influences of Yumiko Oshima's otomechic shoujo manga, such as banana bread pudding on her designs. And you can sort of be the judge. If you compare these two images, you might get the point. So such appropriation and restylization displays a degree of creativity and hence authority exercised by Japanese designers. And lastly, the idea of beauty without eroticization that we've been talking about that is common in shoujo aesthetics is actually remarkably similar to the design philosophy behind Reika Kubo and Comme des Garçons, who's better known aggressively geometric anti-fashion couture. And not only Lolita, but designers like Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons have implemented these shoujo style aesthetics from time to time in her designs, including her revolutionary Black era and even before that. So fashion for women and adolescent girls in particular tends to be polarized between overt sexualization and passive modesty, which is becoming a bit of like a problematic. And it's increasingly difficult to find in between places on this decency continuum. So young women's fashion in particular has to be either very modest or very sexualized, but there's not so much in between. And contributing to this is a tendency in Euro-American societies to regard femininity negatively, or girlish femininity more precisely, with adolescence viewed as unfavorable, unstable, and even pathological stage of life that requires adult intervention, regulation, and protection. So in some respect, this concept of shoujo is innovative, not just an imposed idealized construction, but a mode of girlish identity embraced and manipulated by girls and women themselves. To sum up, shoujo started as an ideological, political construction in order to modernize the Japanese nation. However, the aesthetics of shoujo have been gradually co-opted by the original target audience to serve their own agendas. Shoujo manga created by women for young women has offered an ideal accessible medium to develop, reflect, and experiment with shoujo as a cultural imagining. As examples like Shiroi Saten no Ribbon and Mayumato indicate, beneath the dreamy aesthetic, the frills and lace, even mainstream shoujo can be present a complex, nuanced, and sometimes shocking picture of girlish identity in Japanese popular culture that encompass both objectification and free will, desire and identification. So shoujo can be ambitious, cruel, and cultivate a high level of independent action. Shōjo ideas can also be expressed through fashion, with such sartorial items as lace, frills, ribbons, revealing femininity and beauty, while concealing the body and overt eroticization. In shoujo, we can see different expressions of the same radical fashion, ideas that raised both Reika Kubo and Lolita style to international acclaim. And this is particularly one of my favorite of comedy garçon dresses that are produced or designed much earlier than when comedy garçon became internationally famous in the 1980s, and it looks really shoujo-like dress that she used to design. So I hope I've inspired some of you today, whether you are an academic or shoujo fan, or could be both, but to take a closer look. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think, Erika, we can stop the recording, if you please, so we can have some space and some time and space in order to make our guest say if they have any questions to ask to Dr. Monden. So, okay, the registration is still going on.
If someone doesn't want to talk, you can write the question and we will read to Dr. Monden.
Okay, perfect. Or even if you don't just want to show yourself, you can just keep the camera off and just talk so Dr. Monden can answer your questions. No one? Well, I have to say it was very clear. So there aren't many questions that can be made. Come on, don't be shy. Even our Foscari students, if you don't worry about your English, my English is that as well. Oh, we have a question. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read it for you. Do you think Lolita fashion was somehow influenced by girly 70s fashion from Britain, like Dolly Bertrand? That's a question for you, Dr. Monden.
I think that's a really good point. It's because I think it's very sort of like a melting pot of influences, and one definitely sort of like influence was from the 1950s and 1960s, particularly French like celebrities. And probably Twiggy and the Swing in London as well, in terms of very youthful, slightly androgynous, but very shoujo-like aesthetic. I think it has some influences as well. And not only Lolita, but many of Japanese like actresses and models in the 1960s definitely influenced by the figures in 1960s Britain as well. So I definitely think there's some link or influences.
Thanks, perfect. Thank you for answering. Any other questions? Before we congratulate Dr. Monden for his magistral conference, I'll give you just 1 minute to think about it. Okay, we have another question. I'm going to read it for you, if you please. The lecture was extremely interesting. I was wondering how the shoujo manga style reflected into the BL boys love genre. Just a comment. That's a very nice question, in my opinion.
I should admit that I'm not an expert on boys' love, but what I can say is boys' love, or like a predecessor of boys' love, was originally or initially developed from Shōjo manga, particularly the 1970s. I sort of mentioned that in the 1970s, a group of Shōjo manga artists tried to revolutionize Shōjo manga genre, and like they sort of embraced a lot of like subversive themes and so on. And one of them was like a very highly eroticized love between boys. And that is considered to be one of the predecessors of boys' love. And also there's a Japanese author called Mari Mori who wrote a number of highly aesthetic, very beautiful, but often tragic relationship between like middle-aged academic and teenage boys, or like boys in their early 20s or something. And it's so, you know, very beautifully written, and that's a sort of like stories. And Mari Mori is known as imposing influences on shoujo manga artists, particularly those ones who revolutionized shoujo manga in the 1970s. So there's a link between these Mari Mori's highly beautified and erotic relationship between two men influencing shoujo manga in the 1970s. And from there, there's a sort of like a boys' love sort of becoming becoming an independent genre. That's my understanding.
Perfect. That's really nice. And also, like for everyone wondering here, I am working on a translation from Japanese to Italian by my novel Koibito Tachi no Mori novel. So it will soon be able to be read in Italian also, since there are not many.
Great.
Yeah, not many, like not even in English. So it's nice to have something new to read. And also Ilaria says, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. I'm curious about how the Lolita style is seen by Japanese population nowadays. Is there a specific idea about this style? Thank you very much.
That's a very good question. I think it's sort of becoming a little bit less obvious compared to like 15 years ago or something in Japan. And when Lolita style sort of started getting attention in early 2000s, they were sort of like treated as like a really different sort of subcultural style. So they were different, very visually obvious, but sort of treated as nothing that really different or weird. But it might have changed a little bit these days. If you are there, Meg, you can probably add to this question.
No. So the
Because
question is,
he's
what
a
is it like
expert.
today? Hang on, let me just look at the question. So how leaders are... Okay, so yeah, so hi, I'm a researcher. I've worked with leaders in the contemporary context for 10 years, and I've been working with them on mostly Twitter at the moment. And they spend extensive amounts of time talking about the philosophy of what the leader is and isn't. And they're very, very ferocious. They've got a hidden dagger behind their skirts, as they say. So it is seen as relatively popular. We think the population is about 40,000 at this point. And a little bit of concern about the mainstreaming of their fashion into more other brands like Axe Femme, for example. And there's a bit of concern that the kind of spirit of Lolita will be lost if it becomes more mainstream. But there's also at the same time a really big push for them to be accepted. There's a lot of real discourse about them just wanting to be able to walk down the street and be cute, and they don't understand why everybody's a bit surprised by that. So there's a bit of a dissonance between the resistance element and the wanting to be accepted element that we see in lit fashion today. So it's still around. It is struggling a little bit with COVID. It's a relatively well-recognized genre, mostly because of the work on Twitter, but very, very, very big scene happening there. Hopefully that answers the question. I think I'm rambling a bit, but yeah, it's a spicy space. It's a frilly space. It's a very interesting space. Happy to answer questions, but I think let's let Masafumi talk today. Bye.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan, for interacting with us. Yeah, it would be nice if there could be any other questions. I don't know how much more time Dr. Masafumi has, but
There was another question before.
okay, let me read it.
Was from Asia. Thanks for the lecture. How do you think the gyaru culture relates to the shoujo aesthetics?
That's a really interesting question. We sort of have to distinguish between shoujo as a physical, actual group of young women who are falling into the age group of probably 14 to 18 or something, and like a cultural imagination of shoujo that I sort of mostly talked about today. And I don't think there's a strong link between the shoujo aesthetic that I talked about today and gyaru culture, but also gyaru culture can be quite diverse as well. So many different types of gyaru groups are sort of often bound as one gyaru culture. So it's sort of hard to say what sort of relationship shoujo has with gyaru culture. But I wouldn't say there's completely separated. There might be some sort of elements that they share as well.
Yeah, that's true. I think that like some substyles like himegyaru or himekaji can be very shoujo-esque. But other than the iconic like pen skin, happy makeup gyaru is not so very much shoujo related, but like himegyaru is very often, well, it's almost like completely disappeared from Japanese street fashion today, but back in the day, it used to be very similar to Lolita, but that's the only gyaru substyle similar to it. So, one last question, if you may have one. I give you 1 minute to write it, or otherwise we can greet our great Professor Monden. Let me know. No? Okay, perfect. Then I wish to give like a nice clap to Dr. Monden. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure and an honor for our university. Thank you also for making an engagement between Australian students and our Italian university. It's over for today. Thank you all for participating. I am very happy that many of you participated, and thank you again, Dr. Monden. I'm really happy.
Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day. We are sort of finishing in Sydney. Finishing
yes. Thank you from also Gesshin Association to be here today. And if everyone wants to know what we do here in Foscari as an association, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook.
That's right. Also, like, I think we can finish our registration for today.